In himself was all his state, more solemn than the tedious pomp that waits on princes. This is Milton from Paradise Lost. Prelate, theologian, orator, musician, architect, designer. A genius like no other Gozo had seen. Monsignor Farrugia's peculiar power is to astonish, even 100 years after his passing. Synthesizing the quality of his talents, this paper looks at Farrugia as a man of high culture, steeped in the European civilization into which he was born, bred, and nurtured, and to which he contributed immeasurably. Operating to the high standards he set himself, in an insular climate that could not understand him all the time, sometimes it did not understand him at all, the concepts of civilitas and urbanitas, as advocated by Cicero, will be discussed, with regard to Farrugia's engagement in his work with the refinement of manners in the classical sense. I would also like to share ideas on how art and Christianity, the dynamic with which and for which Monsignor Farrugia worked, are as relevant to us now as they were then. He, above the rest, in shape and gesture, proudly eminent, stood like a tower. Again, this is Milton. There are natures that can only walk tall. Monsignor Farrugia's was one of them. One knows that any work of art which survives the ravages of time is true and beautiful. It grows in stature, and because of its timelessness, it is never outdated. Monsignor Farrugia's prolific mind, his genius, was constantly producing works of art, works that integrate intellect and sensibility. If this were not the case, if he worked with intellect alone, his work would have tended towards automatism. If he worked with sensibility alone, his artistic creations would have been sentimental, because the arts without intellectual context are vanity. We need to believe in some things as beautiful, in some actions and feelings as good, and in some judgments as true. When these three values converge in art, art reaches the sublime. Also, in a sense, art is dependent upon world outlook. Namely, our interest in and appreciation of art cannot be isolated from other interests in life, among them concerns with philosophy, aesthetics, and religion. Art does not bring the mind into conformity with the real, it brings the real into conformity with the mind. The way Farrugia produced his work showed his intelligence in action, for art is the working intelligence. And this brings me to the first consideration of Farrugia, namely, a musician of uncommon standing. Bishop 𝐒𝐭𝐚𝐫 petitioned the Superior General of the Jesuits, Father Beggs, for the relocation of the Sicilian Jesuits to Gozo, in order for them to organize and run the seminary. This was set up in 1866, and it was a serendipitous occasion, for Farrugia received his education from the Jesuit fathers. Particularly, his musical education came from Father 𝐅𝐚𝐫𝐿. However, what the Jesuits gave Farrugia was not just academic tuition, they also gave him a sophisticated set of cultural reference points. There is a metaphysical light thrown on the movement which attracted the artist in Farrugia's time, and which I think still attracts the artist in our age, to the research for the sublime in art, in this case, music, a discipline, among others, in which Farrugia was master. Art, as Aquinas describes it, recta ratio factibilium, art as the right reason in the making of things, which is not wholly human like the moral virtues, and it does not wholly base itself on things like the speculative virtues. There is also the issue of imposed boundaries, either by self or others, or the very culture that gives it birth. If art grows greater in accepted servitudes, it is only by struggling against them. Art is a virtue, an effort towards an activity gratuitously creative, concentrated solely on its own memory and its own operative laws, without subordinating itself either to the interests of man, including the artist himself or herself, or to the evocation of what already exists. In short, the effort towards pure art, sublime art, follows from the very essence of art, once beauty has awakened it to itself. It cannot renounce the effort without betrayal. A too easy resignation to its conditions of existence, meaning the boundaries, is suicide for art. Desublimating the sublime to satisfy the whim of popular demand is the sin of materialism, something that Farrugia never yielded to in the making of his art. There is nothing popular about sublime art. The sublime is exclusive, in that it lives in a domain uninhabited by what is labeled popular. Sublime doesn't do popular. Popularizing the sublime is a contradiction in terms. On the other hand, doing it the other way round, by bringing people closer to this art, refines the sensibility, educates the mind, and enriches the heart. Such, then, is the profound conflict which art cannot evade. The solution is difficult for the artist, as it must have been for Farrugia the musician, and in his other guises as designer and poet. There will be advances and retreats. It will be necessary to aim extremely high, and the higher it goes, the more isolated it gets, and with it, the artist. But Farrugia never settled for less. It will also be necessary to suffer the pain of incomprehension and rejection. Through critical engagement with his compositions, one can deduce that Farrugia advanced in the way of tradition, that is, in via discipline. But Farrugia recognized that to maintain tradition, one has to move on. Tradition cannot mean standing still. Standing still demobilizes and stalls. So, moving in the way of tradition, he showed a way forward. This was only possible by guiding his art in the way of invention, in via inventionis, to that which belongs to its pure form or essence. Therefore, this alliance between essence and conditions of existence would have more charge if it were recognized as helping towards a fair judgment of, I quote, this long quarrel of tradition and invention, of order and adventure, I quote, of which Apollinaire spoke. There is no way that tradition can be sustained if it does not look forward, if it does not change, not in principle but in method. This is the way Farrugia's musical works can be approached, firmly rooted in the neoclassical structure that was emerging in his time, but anticipating the chromaticisms and contrapuntal networks, the contained melodic lines one associates with later styles. Works that come to mind are his Vespers of 1897, the hymn 𝐔𝐬𝐻𝐸, the incomparable Odie Egressa Est Antiphon, and, last but not least, his magnificent Requiem, arguably his greatest musical work, as Stephen Attard manifests in his book. This will be performed in July. There is nothing predictable in these works. Farrugia knew that predictability kills art. You know the work is beyond good when, with multiple hearings, you always feel you're hearing it for the first time. What the listener discerns is the diversions, the subtle modulations, not only of key, but also of thought, which have a significance of feeling and that sophisticates and makes more complex, without destroying the original impulse. This is music that speaks to the intellect. For Monsignor Farrugia, as exemplified in these works, the purpose of art, is beauty, and beauty is style. Style must have been a supremely difficult achievement, which could only have been won by knowledge, calculation, and scrupulous toil against the resistances of popular discourse. Farrugia's musical works project a happy commingling of religion and art. a juxtaposition coexisting in impeccable harmony that underlines the originality and eclecticism of the genius that is Farrugia, an art that strains at the leash of its heterogeneous inheritance and moves towards fresh and compelling pastures. No wonder Farrugia had no disciples. His is a style fatal to imitators. His is a unique voice, distinguished and distinguishable from all other contemporary voices, which more or less, to me at least, sound the same. The way Farrugia treats his musical knowledge is by transposing the secret rules of being into the manner of producing the work. He puts as much fidelity and exactitude into transforming the real according to the laws of the work to be done, in the same way that his scientific acumen on the theory of music does into conforming to it. What his music resembles is not the material appearance of things, but something of the hidden senses that appeal to a refinement and elegance of response, the urbanitas of which Cicero speaks. It is beyond resemblance, but it is resemblance at the same time. But resemblance to what? Not to a pictorial image. It goes beyond that by speaking to the spiritual analogy, and this divination of the spiritual in and through the sensible is what I like to call poetry. And this brings me to the second consideration of Farrugia as he's the literary giant of his time. Metaphysics also pursues the spiritual, but in a way quite different and with quite another formal object. Metaphysics keeps on the line of knowing, of contemplation, of truth. Poetry too is keen on truth, but it keeps on the line of doing, of the delight in beauty. This is an essential difference which cannot be overlooked without loss. The one seizes the spiritual in an idea and by the most abstract intellection. The other glimpses it in the imagination and by the very point of sense which intelligence sharpens. The one enjoys its property only when withdrawn within the eternal regions. The other finds it at all the crossroads of the singular and the contingent. The more than real which both are seeking, philosophy looks for it in the nature of things. For poetry it is enough to see a world in a grain of sand, as Blake sublimely puts it. Poetry is happy with mystery as an unknown and unknowable force, engaging with what Keats calls negative capability. Philosophy, thanks to the equilibria it constructs, uses it as a known and knowable power. From what I have read of Farrugia's prose and poetic works, which I admit is not too much, I could understand that he approaches his art with a pure sensibility, which is a perfect amalgam of the metaphysical and the inspired. He awakens in everything he touches an incomparable poetic substance. The spiritual virtue of his art, when it has arrived at a certain peak in its own heaven, perceives that it is translating into analogy and figures the movement of a higher, inaccessible sphere. There are no compromises in Farrugia's work, and this applies across the disciplines he was master of. There is nothing superficial. Everything he produces requires extreme concentration of engagement. Nothing is easy. The poetic sensibility in what it creates does not do counterfeit of the supernatural and the miraculous, of grace and the heroic virtues. These are works that trigger a revolution of thought, in that they ask us to think differently. Way ahead of their time in Gozo, but also in Malta, they carry with them the voice of a thesis, that is, an idea without precedent, capable of transposing the world we live in into a different key. You go away changed after coming into contact with it. That's what beauty does to you. It's epiphanic. In the cultural and political climate the world finds itself in today, there is no reason to be astonished that, in some, art has elected for mediocrity, the foremost enemy of Farrugia's ideals. On the other hand, it is also a fact that in a smaller number, art has elected for the sublime. An impulse like this will not be easy to check or prove, for it is not verifiable except by time. And Farrugia's art is one such paradigm. It is thus possible to conceive a deliverance of the values of modern art, a renaissance, which the analogy of the operative virtues with the virtues that regulate the moral life would permit us to call a Christian art. Not in the strictly religious sense only, but in the order of artistic creation. This kind of art would be a great and free art, able to communicate the strength of little things. This art is only possible in the hands of a genius, for he or she alone can help redeem the best of its promises. It is the genius who recognizes the validity of objective norms through which boundless humanism can give way to a humanism which sets its own limits. Farrugia's genius revolutionized thinking in the simplest and most effective of ways. By exercising his prodigious talents, he showed us how it's done. And this brings me to the last consideration of Farrugia, the genius. In this sense, genius is the agency which ensures creative freedom. It is the capacity to liberate oneself from natural mechanisms and rule-governed paradigms. But, crucially, it grants this only in so much as one allows one's hand to be steered by nature, by talent, that is. In the third critique, titled categorically Fine Art is the Art of Genius, Immanuel Kant first states the case for genius as being the only sufficient ground for the existence of such a thing as sublime art. Genius, rather than being an ideological fancy, is, for Kant, a structurally necessary concept. Sublime art is only possible as the product of genius. The essential principles of this concept, along with the function it performs, are schematically outlined in a long passage in the third critique. For the purpose of this paper, it suffices to quote just one sentence from that. Quote, "Genius is a talent for producing something for which no determinate rule can be given. Hence, the foremost property of genius must be originality, the talent, the innate predisposition, what Kant calls ingenium, which gives art its rules." Unquote. Thus, it seems to me that genius does not derive from any rule and cannot be learned by following a set of instructions. It follows that originality must be the primary quality and identifiable mark of genius, the ability to create something singular, unique, and unanticipated. Or, in Derrida's words, I quote again, "The genius of the genius, if there is any, enjoins us to think how an absolute singularity subtracts itself from the community of the common, from the mediocre, that is, and thus from the shareable." Unquote. Genius, then, must amount to an opening or interruption in the order of rules and legislation. It follows that if there were no such opening for genius to operate, then there would be nothing but law-governed frameworks that determine and predict in advance what is to be done. The predictability, that is the boredom I referred to earlier. Genius rebels against the mundane. It seeks to eradicate the common, to rise above the mediocre, and to reach exalted heights. Genius is what Horace calls the furor poeticus, the poetic fury, the inspiration. Isn't this a description of Farrugia? Can we, who know him, not say that his musical, literary, architectural works are the result of genius? The musical and literary output of Monsignor Farrugia is impressive, as we know, in range, scope, and scale. His literary masterpiece is doubtlessly his thesis, San Paolo, Padre e Apostolo dei Gozitani, which confirms Monsignor Farrugia the best of apologists on the islands. It is a scholarly work that attests to his erudition, religiousness, and patriotism, that is, to his art, religion, and politics. Additionally, one can sum up the difference in feeling, for there is no difference in style, between his sermons and his poems. In his sermons, there is an intellectualizing of the feeling, while in his poetry there is an emotionalizing of the intellect. It is a perfect example of what 𝐔𝐬𝐻 calls the objective correlative. His is the gift of magnificent sentences, the gift of exposition, the architectonic ability, the power of organization and structure. Farrugia's prose is worth reading, both because it is a significant moment in the history of Maltese prose, and because it has, at its best, uncommon dignity and beauty. A style which gives, at times, what is always unusual in the sermon of Farrugia's time, namely, a direct personal communication without ever coming to blows. A great deal in Farrugia's preaching style, through what I read, is traditional, but a few select passages are produced by a method which is more than that. They are immemorial, not memorable, but immemorial, almost imposed by his innate sense of the poetic. Not unless the listener can deduce this, can he also understand the difference between Farrugia the academic, doing the traditional in a way that others had done in his time, and Farrugia putting into the sermon what no one else had put into it. I mean, his art. It is the perfect alliance of the via disciplina with the via inventionis. Dissolving the extremes of both points, his is the complete and isolated superiority as master of his art. Merely the fact that there are extracts that the reader can draw out from the sermons of Farrugia is indicative. So not everything is the same. These excerpts are enough to show Farrugia's place in Maltese prose. But the sermon is a form of prose, the form in which Farrugia's prose was largely, but not exclusively, written. The sermon also was, and is, a form of literary art. One must know what the sermon was to appreciate what Farrugia accomplished, and finally to know what it was in Farrugia to which the sermon did not give free play. Perhaps this knowledge will supply a clue as to why the sermon is a difficult, perhaps the most difficult form of art. Why compositions, because at the end of the day that's what they are compositions, which are superlatively fine sermons, possess none of the permanent qualities of the true work of art. And why Farrugia, who was a great prose writer, also managed to imbue his essays with qualities that made them superb works of art, the Horatian furor poeticus. Once again, religion and art, both of them as lived experience, are inseparable in Farrugia's works. On the other hand, Farrugia's poetry shows his quickness of imagination, a freedom and originality of rhythm, precision and dignity of language. Read in isolation, this sentence could give the impression that I'm speaking about his music. Well, in a sense I am. His poetry is music, and vice versa. He is a master of the simple everyday word in the right place, and he charges it with concentrated meaning. On reading his magnificent 𝐔𝐬𝐻𝐸, a poem set to music by Farrugia himself, which at one time, by the way, was regarded as a national hymn, one discerns that the images, with their direct meaning in a remarkable way, cancel each other out, so that at the end, an exact suggestion is obtained, which is not even partially present in any of the images taken alone. Here, one gets an extension, a no vague one, beyond the bound of thought. There is a refinement and subdivision of a simple emotion by infusing it into a turn of thought of some difficulty. Regarding two other poems, also set to music by Farrugia, I'm referring to Spento e il Drago and Su Garzoni, both of which are hymns in honor of St. George. The poet-composer yokes a simple passion with throbbing intensity. Here, sensibility is never replaced by sentiment, by the vague expression of the vague. Farrugia possesses a capacity for assimilation with the consequent extent of range. The function of the poetry here is to create a unity of feeling out of various parts. What we get here in these two poems, we do not only have unity of sense, which is epic, but a unity of sound, which is pure lyric. There is an immense technical skill which is necessary to make such discourse fly. But there is also that great emotional intensity necessary to make it soar. And finally, I would like to kind of reflect on the synthesis, which I feel are the three threads which run through his work, and this is art, religion, and culture. What is wrong with being right? In a current world punctured with post-truth, I mean lies, with victims accused for being right, and perpetrators reprieved for being wrong, with world leaders at best uninspiring, at worst criminal or deranged, or both. It is a cultural climate that needs a nobility of ideas, a sophisticated engagement with art that does not jeopardize the standards that people like Farrugia set. The world needs the poetic, long term. Our common culture needs to remember where it's coming from. It is in Christian traditions that our arts have developed. And it is in them that the unwritten laws of Europe have been rooted, no matter what anyone says. What matters most is that it is against such a background that all our thought has significance. If this goes, the whole of our culture goes with it. The European Christian civilization is our Camelot. There were times when art worked in a happy innocence, believing that it was only a trade, sort of, destined for the use or the distraction of man, thinking that it was made to paint grapes that would tempt Demise, exalt great deeds of warfare on a Delacroix canvas, sing odes to Homeric heroes and to kings and queens, adorn assemblies, charm the heart's weariness, teach people, and make them virtuous. It lived then in a servile condition, which does not mean that it was enslaved. It did not deny its nature, it was simply ignorant of it. By virtue of an admirable misunderstanding, its native nobility and liberty, although not proclaimed in what was said or shown or sung in the different art forms, were respected in the silence of what was done. The artist was at the service of his art, not vice versa. Protected by its very obligations and its own humility, art was never happier or more fertile. Those times are gone. They are gone for good. But that art's poetry lives and throbs with immense vitality when revived and executed with good sense and high taste. The civilitas, of which Cicero speaks when he refers to courteousness, refinement, elegance of style and manner. Saying that such art is not accessible to all does not make that art wrong. And it's not an excuse for it not to thrive. Saying, I don't understand this poem or that piece of music or whatever, is going about it the wrong way. Art is not there for you to sort it out. It's there for it to sort you out. Again, Farrugia shows us the way. As Monsignor Paolo Cauchi said in his obituary for Farrugia, he, Farrugia that is, I quote, was sensibilissimo alle bellezze dell'arte, extremely empathetic to the beauties of art. With more sophistication in art, there may come a point when societies would be able to tell the wheat from the chaff. Settling for less, we would only reap harvests seasoned with poisoned herbs. All strong civilizations impose constraints on art because they subject the whole domain of the practical to the primacy of the good of man, and they order all things powerfully for this good. This is what the European Christian civilization has done for us. Enough has been said of the advantages that art, if it will, may draw from these constraints, but not art alone. The miserable political state of the modern world, the eroding values of our Christian fabric, makes one long with a peculiar intensity for the rediscovery of a real civilization, begging the question, where the hell did it all go wrong? If, however, this longing must remain without fulfillment and the universal dissolution continue, we should console ourselves if we see, as the world destroys itself, the things of the spirit reassembling their forces through the genius who is in the world and yet not of the world. If the spirit that floated over the waters must now hover over the ruins, then so be it. It is enough that it comes, for only then could the ruins be restored. What is certain, as I see it, whichever way it goes, is that we are reaching a time when all hopes that are set lower than the standards imposed by excellence will be disappointed. Is this not Farrugia? He is a point of reference, unshaken by the sterile gusts of mediocrity. It is not the first time that the approach to culture, as embraced by Farrugia, was labelled elitist, even in our own time and from whom one expects it least. One is aware that a democracy in which everybody has an equal responsibility in everything would be oppressive for the conscientious and licentious for the rest. Complete equality, in this sense, means universal irresponsibility. At this point, together with the visionary Shelley, I ask, art thou pale for weariness of climbing heaven and gazing on the earth? I imagine there were moments when Farrugia was pale for weariness in his dealing with his contemporaries, but because the quality of his solutions was always more potent than the quality of the problems thrown to his face, he kept soaring, per ardua ad astra. The sum of his art is informed by an ageless tradition of European values. The conception of culture and religion as being different aspects of the same thing, when each term is taken in the right context, is one which requires a good deal of explanation. However, I should like to suggest, first, that it also provides us with the means of combating two complementary errors. The one more widely held is that culture can be preserved, extended, and developed in the absence of religion. This potential error may be held by the Christian in common with the infidel, and its proper refutation would require a historical analysis of considerable refinement, because the truth is not immediately apparent and may also seem to be contradicted by appearances. I mean, a culture may linger on and indeed produce some of its most brilliant artistic and other successes after the religious faith has fallen into decay. The other error, less regarded and more denied, is the belief that the preservation and maintenance of religion need not reckon with the preservation and maintenance of culture. This is a belief that may even lead to the rejection of the products of culture as frivolous obstructions to the spiritual life. To be in a position to reject this error, as with the other, requires us to take a distant view. To refuse to accept the conclusion when the culture that we see is a culture in decline, that culture is something to which we can afford to remain indifferent. Aesthetic sensibility must be extended into spiritual perception, and vice versa, before we are qualified to pass judgment upon decadence, mediocrity, and diabolism in art. To judge a work of art by artistic or religious standards, or to judge a religion by religious or artistic standards, should come in the end to the same thing. And the end is a strange one. Yet, as with valid strange conclusions, it is also utterly simple. What is part of our culture is also a part of our lived religion. Beauty always contains a touch of strangeness, of simple, unmediated, and unconscious strangeness. Farrugia's works are such examples. Human thought at its most strange, for it is at its most unique. In conclusion, seen in this context, and there are others of course, Farrugia's achievements speak to our times. His works repeatedly offer insight and hope for charting a course above the mess of opinions, the mess of prejudices, and lack of discernment to address some of the most pressing concerns and problems not only of his day, but also ours. Monsignor Farrugia deserves to be read, heard, and known today for his language's extraordinary majesty and elegance. By language, I also refer to musical language. It is one imbued with a ferocious sense of purpose, primarily that of beautifying his beloved church of St. George. He left a name because he left a legacy. Just listen to those bells. One touch of that aristocratic A-flat at the end of Giardini's Inno a San Giorgio Martire is enough to send our multitudes into delirious raptures of joy and hope. It is a sound Farrugia never heard, for he died before the incomparable set of bells he tuned for us arrived in Gozo. We know exactly how it sounds, but there's nothing predictable about it. It's always new, as it was the first time it rang. That's the genius of Farrugia. He is a dear son of memory, great heir of fame, a star undimmed, pater et magister. Thank you.